Careful, sweetheart, that tray probably costs more than you make in a week, the man said, his voice smooth with amusement as laughter rippled across the private dining room, crystal glasses catching the golden light, while Ava Brooks stood still for half a second too long, the faint clink of ice settling in a glass louder than it should have been, her fingers steadying the edge of the silver tray as she nodded once, polite, invisible, just another waitress moving through a room filled with tailored suits and million-dollar decisions, except tonight something felt off, the air heavier. Like the moment before a storm breaks, she turned slightly, placing a drink beside a sleek laptop left open on the table, numbers glowing against the dark screen, projections, percentages, projected returns stacked in neat columns, and her eyes caught on one line, just for a second, but it was enough. The kind of mistake you don't see unless you've spent nights staring at balance sheets instead of sleeping, the kind that doesn't just cost money, it erases it. Ava inhaled quietly, her pulse tightening as another man leaned back in his chair, joking about closing the deal before dessert arrived, $50 million riding on signatures that hadn't touched paper yet. She stepped back, but her gaze lingered, recalculating without meaning to, numbers shifting in her head faster than she could stop them. Inflation of projected returns, misaligned risk exposure, a clause buried deep that flipped the liability in a way no one here seemed to notice. Or maybe they didn't expect someone like her to notice. A waitress in a pressed black uniform, name tag slightly worn, background dismissed before it could speak. "You're still here?" Another voice cut in, sharper this time, Ethan Caldwell finally glancing up, his expression bored, dismissive, already done with her presence. Ava felt the weight of the room turn, subtle but real, eyes sliding over her like she was part of the furniture. Something to move around, not listen to. She should have walked away. That was the rule. Serve, smile, leave, don't cross the invisible line between them and you. But her hand tightened slightly against the tray, knuckles pale under the soft lighting, and the number stayed there, loud, wrong, dangerous. "Sir?" Her voice came out quieter than she expected, but it didn't shake, not this time. The conversation paused just enough for irritation to surface. A few smirks exchanged, someone chuckled under their breath. "I think there's an error," she said, and the room stilled in a different way now, not loud, not amused, just sharp, like something fragile had been touched. Ethan's eyes lifted fully. This time, narrowing slightly, measuring, dismissing. "An error?" he repeated, slow, controlled, like the word itself didn't belong coming from her. Ava nodded once, steady, even as she felt every unspoken judgment pressing in. "In your return projection, it's inflated." A beat of silence followed, then laughter again, louder, colder, cutting through the air as one of the investors leaned forward, shaking his head. "Did you hear that?" he said, amusement dripping from every word. "She thinks she found a mistake," another voice added. "That's cute." Ava didn't move, didn't flinch, even as a security guard shifted closer at the edge of the room, waiting for the signal to remove her. Ethan exhaled slowly, picking up his pen again, already done, already dismissing her as irrelevant. But Ava spoke one more time, softer now, almost a whisper carried by the quiet hum of the room. "If you sign that, you won't just lose money," she said, her eyes flicking once more to the screen. "You'll lose everything." And this time, the laughter didn't come as quickly, because one of the men had already turned back to the laptop, scrolling, his expression beginning to change. The man closest to the laptop stopped laughing first, his fingers slowing on the trackpad as the glow of the screen reflected across his face. The numbers no longer clean, no longer certain. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly as he leaned in closer, zooming into the line Ava had glanced at, a single clause buried beneath layers of polished language and projected growth. His brows tightened, then lowered. And the air in the room changed without anyone announcing it, like temperature dropping just before a storm settles. Ethan Caldwell noticed the shift and glanced sideways, irritation flickering across his face as he tapped the pen once against the table. "What is it now?" he said, not looking at Ava, not yet, but the man did not answer right away. He kept scrolling, slower this time, deliberate, reading each line as if seeing it for the first time. Another investor leaned forward, curiosity replacing amusement. The quiet hum of conversation faded into a tight silence, Ava remained where she stood, tray still balanced in her hands, her breathing steady but her chest tight, every second stretching longer than it should. The guard near the door hesitated, unsure now, waiting for direction that had not come. "It is just a projection model," someone muttered, trying to pull the room back to certainty, but the man at the laptop shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in realization. "No," he said under his breath, almost to himself. "This is not just projection." His voice was lower now, focused, and that caught Ethan's attention more than anything else. Ethan set the pen down slowly and leaned in, finally giving the screen his full attention, the polished confidence in his posture beginning to fracture at the edges. "Explain," he said, the single word controlled but sharper than before. The man exhaled once, then pointed at the screen. "This adjustment here," he said. "It is not just optimistic. It shifts the risk exposure entirely. If the market dips even slightly, the liability flips to us." He paused, glancing up, then back down, recalculating as he spoke. "We do not just lose the upside, we absorb the downside completely." Another silence followed, heavier this time, not disbelief, but comprehension settling in piece by piece. Someone across the table reached for a tablet, tapping quickly, cross-checking, the faint tapping sound echoing louder than it should in the stillness. Ava's eyes lowered briefly, not out of fear, but restraint. She had said what needed to be said, nothing more, nothing less. Ethan's jaw tightened as he leaned closer to the screen, his fingers resting on the edge of the table, no longer relaxed, no longer dismissive. The numbers were not aligning the way they should, the clean narrative of profit unraveling into something far more dangerous. "That is not possible," one investor said quietly, but there was no conviction behind it now, just hope, fragile and thinning. The man at the laptop shook his head again, slower this time. "It is," he said. "And if we sign this as is—" He paused, the weight of the conclusion settling over the room. "We take the full hit." A glass shifted slightly as someone's hand moved unconsciously, the faint sound cutting through the silence. Ethan did not speak immediately, his eyes scanning, recalculating, reconstructing the deal in his mind, and for the first time that night, he looked up at Ava, not past her, not through her, but at her, as if trying to understand how she had seen it so quickly, how someone he had dismissed moments ago had just interrupted a decision that could have cost millions. The room waited. No one laughing now, no one speaking, just the quiet hum of realization spreading across polished wood and crystal reflections, and Ava stood there, still, composed, the tray steady in her hands, as the balance of power in the room shifted without a single word announcing it. No one told her to leave this time, and that alone felt louder than the laughter from moments ago. Ava remained still as the room recalibrated around her, the soft glow from the laptop reflecting across polished glass and tense faces. Ethan Caldwell leaned back slightly, not in comfort but in calculation, his eyes no longer dismissive but searching, piecing together what had just shifted beneath him. "Walk me through it," he said finally, his voice controlled but different now, directed at Ava. Not around her. A subtle pause followed as if the room itself needed to adjust to that change. Ava hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear but out of habit. People like her were not invited into conversations like this. They were expected to move silently through them. But the silence now was expectant, waiting, and she stepped forward just enough to see the screen clearly. Setting the tray down on the edge of the table with a soft, precise motion, her hands free now, steady, the projection assumes a stable growth curve, she said, her voice calm, measured, but the clause tied to it shifts the downside risk entirely onto your side if the threshold is not met. She pointed lightly, not touching the screen, just guiding attention. This adjustment inflates the return to make the deal look balanced, but it is not balanced, it is tilted. One of the investors leaned closer, following her line of reasoning, his earlier confidence replaced with focus. "So if the market dips, even 5%, he began, testing the logic. Ava nodded once. "You absorb the loss, all of it," she said, no emphasis, no drama, just fact. The words settled into the room like weight, undeniable and heavy. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, slower now, deliberate, Why was this not flagged? He asked, not looking at Ava this time, but at his team, the question sharper than before. A man across from him shifted in his chair, adjusting his cuff as if buying time. It is a complex structure, he said carefully, but the explanation felt thin even as he spoke it. Ethan's gaze returned to the screen, then to Ava again, studying her in a way that was no longer dismissive, but curious, almost unsettled. And you saw this, how? He asked, the question hanging between skepticism and recognition. Ava's eyes flicked down briefly, then back up, steady. It is in the pattern, she said. When numbers are pushed too clean, too perfect, something is usually being hidden underneath. The room stayed quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood was already there. One of the investors exhaled slowly, leaning back as the realization settled deeper. We were about to sign this, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Ethan did not respond immediately, his posture still, controlled, but the tension in his jaw visible now, the kind that comes when certainty is replaced by doubt. He picked up the pen again, turning it once between his fingers, then set it back down without writing. The decision paused, suspended. Ava stepped back slightly, not reclaiming distance, but respecting it, her role in the room unclear but undeniable. The guard by the door lowered his stance just enough to signal that whatever had been about to happen earlier no longer applied. The balance had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and for the first time that night, Ava was no longer invisible, not because she demanded attention, but because the truths she carried had made it impossible to ignore her. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him, eyes fixed not on the screen now but on Ava, measuring something that had nothing to do with numbers. Who trained you? He asked, the question quiet but direct, the kind that did not belong to small talk. Ava held his gaze for a moment before answering. No one recently, she said, her voice even. I studied finance. Before I had to stop. A subtle glance passed between the men at the table, curiosity replacing the earlier dismissal. One of them leaned forward, elbows on the polished wood. Stop, he repeated, as if the word itself did not fit the image in front of him. Ava nodded once. Life happens, she said simply, not offering more, not needing to. The explanation hung there, complete in its brevity. Ethan's expression shifted again, something softer beneath the control, but it did not linger. He turned back to the screen. Run the downside scenario, he instructed, his voice sharper now, focused. One of his analysts moved quickly, fingers tapping across the keyboard, the model recalculating in real time, numbers adjusting, projections collapsing into a different shape entirely. The room watched as the clean upward curve flattened, then dipped, then broke, the potential loss no longer abstract but visible, undeniable. One investor exhaled slowly, leaning back as if the air had been pulled from his chest. That is a 7-figure hit, he said, almost under his breath. Another shook his head. More if litigation follows. The weight of that word settled heavily. Litigation, not just loss but consequence. Ethan's jaw tightened, the polished confidence from earlier replaced by something more grounded, more cautious. And this clause, he said, tapping lightly on the table, it locks us into that exposure. The analyst nodded, not meeting his eyes. Yes, he said, the single word enough. No one spoke for a moment after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been revealed. Ava stood just outside the edge of the table now, no longer at the center but no longer invisible either, her hands resting lightly at her sides, steady, composed, as if she had always belonged in rooms like this, even if the room had not known it. Ethan turned his head slightly, looking at her again, this time without the barrier of assumption. You saw all of that from a glance, he said, not a question, but not quite a statement either. Ava gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. Patterns repeat, she said. You just have to know what to look for. A faint shift moved through the room, respect, not spoken, but present. One of the investors straightened in his chair, his earlier amusement gone entirely, replaced by something closer to humility. We almost signed that, he said again, this time louder, as if needing the room to acknowledge it. Ethan picked up the contract, flipping through the pages with measured precision, the sound of paper cutting through the quiet. Then he stopped, holding it for a moment, the decision in his hands no longer automatic, no longer certain. He placed it back down on the table, not signed, not finalized, just paused, suspended. Between what was and what could have been, the guard by the door shifted his weight again, but this time it was not in anticipation of removal, it was uncertainty. As if the rules of the room had quietly changed without anyone announcing it, Ava took a small step back, instinct guiding her to return to her role, but something in the room held her there, an unspoken acknowledgement that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Not because she demanded it, but because the truth she brought with her had reshaped everything in its path. The contract remained untouched in the center of the table, its crisp edges now carrying a different weight, not opportunity but consequence, and no one reached for it anymore. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward slowly, resting his forearms on the polished surface, his gaze fixed on the numbers that had betrayed him. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls had drawn in just enough to make everyone aware of what had nearly happened. Who drafted this model? He asked, his voice calm but carrying a sharper edge than before. One of the analysts hesitated, glancing briefly at a colleague before answering. It came from Von Global's team, he said, carefully, choosing each word with precision. We reviewed it, but the structure was layered. Ethan's jaw flexed slightly, not in anger, but in realization, the kind that arrives too late to be comfortable. Layered, he repeated, the word lingering in the air, then fading into silence. One of the investors leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. Layered enough to hide a transfer of risk, he said, his tone no longer amused, no longer confident, just factual. Ava stood a few steps away, her presence steady but quiet, as if she understood the moment did not belong to her anymore, yet she remained part of it, inseparable from the shift that had taken place. Ethan reached for the contract again, flipping through the pages with slower movements this time, reading not for confirmation but for truth, each page turning with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. We would have taken the full exposure, he said, more to himself than anyone else, and they would have walked away clean. No one disagreed, no one could. The numbers had already spoken. One of the investors rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his earlier confidence replaced with a quiet unease. This was not an oversight, he said, looking around the table. This was intentional. The words settled heavily, not dramatic, not loud, just undeniable. Ethan closed the contract slowly, placing it flat on the table, his hand resting on top of it for a moment, as if grounding himself in the decision he had not made. The pen sat beside it, untouched, its presence now symbolic of something far greater than a signature. Ava's eyes flicked briefly toward the door, a subtle instinct pulling her back toward the role she had stepped out of, but she did not move yet. Something held her there, not obligation, not expectation, but the quiet awareness that what happened next would define more than just a deal. Ethan lifted his gaze again, looking directly at her, and for a moment the room disappeared, leaving only the weight of recognition between them. You saved us from a very expensive mistake, he said, his voice steady, stripped of arrogance, stripped of distance, just truth. Ava did not respond immediately, not because she did not hear him, but because she did not expect to be addressed this way, not here, not by him. She gave a small nod, almost reflexive. I just pointed out what was there, she said, her tone calm, unchanged, the simplicity of her words contrasting the magnitude of what they meant. One of the investors let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. We almost signed away millions, he said, his voice carrying a trace of disbelief. Ethan straightened in his chair, his posture no longer rigid but resolved. We are not signing anything tonight, he said firmly, the decision cutting cleanly through the room. No hesitation, no debate, just finality. The analysts nodded quickly, already moving to close files, to shut down projections that no longer held power. The atmosphere shifted again, not tense now, but grounded, the kind of calm that follows when disaster has been avoided but not forgotten. Ava finally took a step back, her role instinctively calling her away, But the space she left behind did not close the way it had before, it remained open, altered, as if the room itself would not forget what she had revealed, and as she reached for the tray once more, the soft reflection of light across its surface mirrored something that had quietly changed, not in her, but in the way she was seen. The room did not return to what it had been before, it settled into something quieter, heavier, as if every surface now carried the echo of what had nearly happened. Ava lifted the tray again, the familiar weight grounding her as she stepped back from the table, the soft fabric of her sleeve brushing against the edge of a chair, a small, ordinary movement that felt different now, noticed, acknowledged, yet she kept her gaze low, not out of submission, but out of discipline, the kind built from years of knowing when to step forward and when to disappear. Behind her the analysts began closing laptops, screens dimming one by one, the glow fading from their faces, the deal no longer alive, just a document with consequences that had been avoided. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his hand resting near the untouched pen, his eyes distant, not focused on the room but on the space just beyond it, as if replaying the moment when everything shifted, the quiet before the mistake became irreversible. One of the investors stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, his movements deliberate. "We were too close," he said, his voice low, not directed at anyone in particular, just spoken into the air. Another nodded, exhaling as if releasing something held too tightly. "Closer than we realized," he added the words. Landing without resistance, Ava moved toward the side station, placing the tray down with care, the soft clink of glass against metal barely audible. She reached for a folded cloth, her hands moving through the routine with precision, wiping a clean surface that did not need cleaning, a motion more about returning to rhythm than necessity. The overhead lights reflected in the polished countertop, casting a steady glow across her hands, across the small details that grounded her in the present. The distant murmur of the dining room beyond the private space drifted in, soft, ordinary, untouched by what had just unfolded, a reminder that the world outside continued without pause. Ethan finally stood, the movement drawing a subtle shift in the room. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing the front as if resetting himself, but the expression on his face remained altered, less certain, more aware. He took a step toward the table again, glancing at the closed contract, then toward the laptop. Then finally toward Ava, who now stood near the edge of the room, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if ready to return fully to her role at any moment. He paused, not speaking yet, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, the kind that holds meaning without words. Ava sensed it but did not turn immediately. She finished folding the cloth in her hands, precise, measured, then looked up, meeting his gaze across the distance, the space between them no longer defined by hierarchy alone, but by something quieter, something earned in a single moment that could not be undone. Either of them spoke. And yet the room felt full, not with tension, but with understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced. Outside the window the city lights flickered against the glass, reflections overlapping, blending, the movement of cars far below reduced to soft streaks of white and red, distant, steady, unchanged. Inside, everything had shifted, and in that quiet, Ava took a slow breath, not of relief, not of pride, just of stillness. The kind that comes after standing your ground when it would have been easier to walk away, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one interrupted the silence, because even without words, everyone in that room understood that something had just been revealed, not only about the deal, but about the people in it. The silence finally shifted when Ethan took a slow step forward, not toward the door, not toward his team, but toward Ava, and that alone caused a subtle ripple across the room, the kind that made people straighten slightly without knowing why. He stopped just short of the service station, close enough now that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier but a choice. His voice when he spoke was quieter than before, stripped of performance. "You said you studied finance?" he began, his tone no longer questioning her presence but trying to understand it. Ava held his gaze steady, unflinching. "Yes," she said simply, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, the folded cloth still between her fingers. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, then glanced briefly back at the table, at the closed contract, at the laptop now dimmed. "That was not basic knowledge," he said, more to himself than to her. That was pattern recognition under pressure. Ava did not react. To the phrasing, she only gave a slight breath, almost imperceptible. It is easier to see things when you are not the one trying to make them work, she replied, her voice calm, not defensive, just honest. One of the investors, still standing near the table, shifted closer, drawn back into the conversation despite himself. You mean when you are not invested in the outcome? He said. Ava nodded once. Exactly, she answered, the simplicity of it landing heavier than any technical explanation. Ethan watched her for a moment. Longer, something in his expression changing again, not just curiosity now, but recognition, the kind that settles when a truth becomes undeniable. We had a full team reviewing this, he said slowly. And no one caught it. The words carried no accusation, just fact. One of the analysts lowered his eyes slightly, the weight of that statement not lost on him. Ava shifted her weight subtly, not uncomfortable, but aware of the attention. Sometimes you stop questioning things when you expect them to work, she said. You trust the structure too much. The room absorbed that quietly, no one rushing to respond, because it did not feel like criticism, it felt like clarity. Ethan exhaled once, a controlled release of tension, then straightened slightly, his posture settling into something more grounded, more present. What would you have done? He asked, the question direct now, intentional. Ava paused for the first time, not because she did not know, but because she understood the weight behind it. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass, then back to him. I would not sign it tonight, she said, echoing his earlier decision without hesitation. I would break down the model line by line, rebuild the assumptions, and find out where the risk actually belongs. A quiet shift moved through the room again, not surprise this time, but agreement. One of the investors nodded slowly. That is exactly what we need to do, he said, almost to himself. Ethan held her gaze for another moment, then gave a small, deliberate nod, not dismissive, not polite, but acknowledging, the kind of gesture that carries weight without needing words. Thank you, he said, and the words landed differently than anything he had said before, not formal, not transactional, just real. Ava did not smile, did not step forward, she only inclined her head slightly, accepting it without needing more, because the moment itself had already said everything. Behind them the room began to move again, quiet conversations restarting, decisions shifting direction. But the space between them remained still for just a second longer, a pause in time where everything that had been assumed earlier no longer applied, and in that pause, something fundamental had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The room did not return to its earlier rhythm, it moved forward with a new kind of awareness, quieter, more deliberate, as if every decision now carried the memory of what had almost been lost. Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze shifting from Ava to the table and back again, weighing something that extended beyond numbers and contracts. Then he made a decision that did not require a vote. Stay, he said, his voice calm but firm, directed at Ava, and the single word caused a subtle pause across the room, not confusion, but adjustment. Ava blinked once, not out of uncertainty but surprise, the kind that comes when expectation is quietly overturned. Sir, she began, her tone respectful but measured, as if clarifying her place. Ethan shook his head slightly, not dismissing her, but the formality itself. Not as staff, he said, his voice steady. Sit with us. The words settled differently than any invitation she had ever received, not a gesture of politeness, but a recognition of value. One of the investors glanced at Ethan, then at Ava, then back again, as if recalibrating what this moment meant. No one objected, no one laughed, the earlier hierarchy no longer holding the same weight. Ava hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood the line she was being asked to cross. Then she stepped forward. Slow, deliberate, pulling out a chair at the edge of the table, not at the center, not claiming space that was not hers, but no longer standing outside it either. The chair made a soft sound against the floor as she sat, her posture straight, composed, her hands resting lightly together. The room watched for a moment, then shifted, accepting, adapting. Ethan returned to his seat, the movement now mirrored, not above her, not removed, but part of the same conversation. "We need to rebuild this from the ground up," he said, his focus returning to the task, but his tone different now, more open. One of the analysts nodded quickly, reopening the laptop, the screen lighting up again, but this time without the illusion of certainty, just raw data waiting to be understood. Ethan glanced at Ava, not for approval, but for input. "Start with the assumptions," she said, her voice calm, steady, the words fitting naturally into the space. "If the foundation is wrong, everything built on it will fail." The simplicity of it cut through the complexity that had hidden the problem before. The analyst adjusted the model, stripping it back line by line, numbers shifting, recalculating, the curve flattening into something more realistic, less appealing but more honest. One investor leaned in, studying the changes. "This looks different," he said, not disappointed, but aware. Ava nodded slightly. "It is closer to the truth," she replied, and that word lingered longer than any projection. Truth, not profit, not gain, but something more stable, more lasting. Ethan watched the screen, then looked at her again, the shift in his expression subtle but clear, respect no longer forming, but settled. "You should not be serving tables," he said quietly, not as a judgment of her present, but as an acknowledgement of her capability. Ava did not react outwardly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes held steady. "Right now, I am exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice even, not defensive, not apologetic, just grounded. The room absorbed that without challenge, because it did not feel like limitation, it felt like choice. The work continued, numbers adjusting, conversations aligning, but the center of the room had changed. Not the table, not the contract, but the people around it, and as the night moved forward, no one returned to who they had been before, especially not the man who had once dismissed her with a single glance, because now, every time he looked at her, he saw not a role, but a mind that had already altered the course of everything in front of him. The meeting did not end with applause or celebration, it dissolved quietly into decisions that would ripple far beyond the room. Laptops closed with soft clicks, documents stacked with care, voices lowered into focused conversation as the team began rebuilding what had nearly been signed away. Ava remained seated until the final numbers settled into something stable, something honest, then she rose without drawing attention, her chair sliding back with a faint sound that no longer felt invisible. She stepped away from the table, not hurried, not hesitant, just certain, as if the role she had stepped into for a moment had already completed its purpose. Ethan noticed before anyone else did, his eyes lifting from the screen as she moved toward the service station, the quiet rhythm of her steps grounding the room once more. He stood as well, not abruptly, but with intention. "Ava," he said, and the use of her name carried more weight than any title. She paused, turning slightly, her expression calm, unchanged. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a business card, simple, understated, but heavy with meaning. He stepped closer, extending it toward her. "If you ever decide you want to come back to this," he said, his tone measured, not offering, not persuading, just opening a door, "call me." Ava looked at the card for a second, not immediately taking it, not out of doubt, but out of understanding. She reached forward, accepting it with the same steady hand that had held the tray earlier, the same hand that had shifted the direction of everything in that room. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said, not for the opportunity alone, but for the acknowledgement behind it. Ethan gave a small nod in return, no longer needing to explain anything else, because the moment had already said enough. Ava turned back toward the service station, picking up the tray once more, the familiar weight settling into her hands, but it no longer felt the same, not heavier, not lighter, just different, as if the meaning behind it had shifted. She walked toward the door, passing by the polished table where the contract still rested, unsigned, untouched, a silent reminder of what had almost happened. The room continued behind her, voices steady, focused, but no longer careless, and as she reached the doorway, she did not look back, not because she had nothing to see, but because she already understood what had changed. Outside, The hallway lights were softer, the distant sounds of the restaurant returning, plates clinking, conversations blending into a quiet hum, ordinary life continuing as it always did. Ava stepped into it without hesitation, her reflection briefly catching in the glass along the corridor, the name on her tag visible for just a moment before she moved past it. And somewhere behind her, in a room filled with power and polished decisions, a man who had once dismissed her now sat in silence for a second longer than necessary, not because he had lost control, but because he had finally seen something he could not ignore, and that realization, quiet and unspoken, lingered long after she was gone.